Okay. My name is Clara. I'll be chairing this round. Please approach panel as a whole. I would like my panelists to introduce themselves in the order in which they appear on tap.
Hi, it's Iman. He, him, please. Good luck, everyone.
Hi, it's Jade. I'm a trainee. She, her.
Excellent. Let's now go with the speaking order by the teams, starting with OG. And if you don't want to disclose your pronouns on the recording, please just type it in the chat and just do the mic check. That will be fine. Thank you. OG, followed by OOCGCO.
Hello, this is Dragos, no preference.
Anna speaking second, sure, that is fine.
OO.
Speaking first is Sarenna, she, they.
Jacob second, he, they.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I will be speaking first, he, him, they.
And speaking second, Nick, he, him, please. Thanks.
Bella, member, she, her. Sophie, whip, she, her.
Excellent. That being said, if one of my panelists want to put timestamps into the chat, feel free. Otherwise, please use Debate Keeper or your own timer. Speech is 7 minutes 15. And yeah, good luck, everyone. Happy to call the Prime Minister to open this round.
Thank you. Please give me 10 more seconds. Awesome. I'll start now. Look, fairness in justice and its procedural implications should obtain a different sort of legitimacy, social legitimacy, than the legitimacy offered through traditional politics. Opening opposition in this debate needs to explain us why the politicians, the people who have an ideology, especially in the US states, where basically there's two ideologies to pick from and no diversity, should have a fundamental right to dictate how politics should work, aka the relation between politics and the Supreme Court, and then how the fundamental rights that people have in a society should be defended. We believe that this sort of conversation requires direct and a specific type of legitimacy which comes directly from the people. Look, we believe that let's talk about the people who will candidate and how will this actually work. Look, in our world, we believe there's going to be a set of independent individuals coming from the legal system. They will candidate with a plan, a simplified agenda, which will probably have a set of priorities that they want to chase from, and they can choose from things like the speed that through which trials are being solved, the operations and the allocations of resources, how many courts of justice are we funding, and how many judges, the criminal catch rate, and then the rate through which we put up people through the judicial system over the amount of people who are actually found guilty and the allocation of resources, or whether we prioritize the amount of people that redo a crime and versus minimizing the amount of people that redo a crime versus maximizing the punishment that people get into the justice system. Look, we believe that all of these issues are problems that are above the political divide between the Republicans and Democrats. We believe that it's hard to find a 100% match between this sort of an agenda and a Republican and of a Democrat Party agenda. Therefore, there's a high likelihood that they will appeal to both Democrats and to both Republicans. Who are most likely going to be these people? Probably the best 5 or 10 people in that branch, in that period. Probably among them would be people that would normally be nominated by the executive branch, but they will now have to go through this extra layer of election in order to get that position. How does the voting logic work in this way? Look, the electorate is already used in US with the election of members of the criminal justice system. They already elect the state prosecutor. So we believe that some Republicans and some Democrats will probably vote in order the winning candidate, because look, the reoffend rate, the speed to trial, the degree of the burden of proof that an individual needs in order to be convicted, all of these things are apolitical. There's a different sort of conversation that needs to be had, and oftentimes members from the two parties, like fans of the both parties, can agree on, for example, prioritizing the speed of going to trial versus the amount of reoffenders, right? So what do we achieve out of this? Now, thank you, POIs later. We achieved two things. A, more representativity in terms of the list of the things that are being prioritized by this individual. The second thing, it is its ability to independently decide what its actions are or not. There's no political leverage now that the party has over this institution, over this specific individual, because now they are no longer dependent on the specific party to nominate them or to revoke their support, because this is equally important. In the opposition side, a party can come and say, you are not respecting our party line, we are removing your support, and we will nominate someone else. What it also says, what we also achieve with this independent is that there's a higher chance that it will serve the principle of justice rather than the principle of political representation. What this basically means, it means that it serves the needs of the justice system rather than needs of the Republican or Democrat, whoever is in power at that point, and therefore making the justice system more independent. Look, in the opposition world, the system is politicized. The person who is being chosen at the moment to take this position needs to pay back to the Republican or the Democrat electorate. The best proof here is the people who are nominated at the Supreme Court by these parties. They are constantly voting laws or promoting views in the Supreme Court, which represent the political party line. No, thank you, slightly later. This means is that the Republican, if the Republicans are in power, are always right, regardless of whether there's a benefit or not for the judicial system on the decisions that these people are taking. For example, one of the things that Donald Trump is proposing under its candidacy is to replace the members of the Department of Justice that represent the institution in each and every county in order to put people that are more close to its views. If we were to insert an independent an independent attorney general, there will be an extra systems of checks and balances in place that would not propagate the mindset and the needs of the Republican Party in the ground. Before moving to the court, CEO, please, POI.
Yeah, do you think that the public or members of parliament are more informed when it comes to the roles and responsibilities of the Attorney General?
We believe that as long as the agenda is clear enough, they have enough information. B, it's a set of principles that we should chase. C, it's no longer, when you're asking a party to take that decision, it's no longer about being informed or not. It's about serving your own personal needs. What I'm going to further add here, just because you are a member of parliament which has been voted by a specific electorate coming from the left or from the right, it doesn't mean that your decisions are reflecting 100% the interests of those people. Once you are in power, you have your own agenda and you're using all the tools, including this, in order to further whatever are your objectives. Those objectives are not always the most legitimate things which are aligned with the people that you're representing. What does this mean? In our world, there's more moments where the Attorney General will actually vote in order to, act in order to protect the system of justice. Less political intervention. More chances where we can say, hey, Mr. President, you're taking the wrong decision. I'm also going to the public to tell this. This leads to more legitimacy in the judicial system and more trust in the end. This is when people respect the law. For all of these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We're happy to call Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Government in this case somehow wants you to believe that elections will undo all of the politicization that is going to be really, really harmful for the position of Attorney General. Because, you know, when we think of elections, we don't think of them being very heavily politicized. What I'm going to do in this speech is first explain, I'm first going to do some responding to OG and then 2 arguments. First, I'm going to talk about why bureaucracy is necessary for certain roles. And second, I'm going to talk about why elections for roles that tend to require special types of expertise lead to very bad outcomes. First, on dealing with OG. They say that this position doesn't really map onto party politics, so you can appeal to people on both sides of the aisle. I think this is just not true. Look at issues that are like involved, if the DOJ gets involved in. Voter suppression, prosecuting Trump and other politicians that tried to deny the election, appealing constitutionally on things like mandatory minimums and other like sentencing practices that are used. The whole role of the DOJ is to advocate, and the role of the Attorney General is to make decisions in the case of these often highly politicized issues. And we think that that just means that, like, by virtue, it is going to be politicized when there's an election that occurs, because there is an ideological slant to which option you decide to pursue once you're elected and what the actions undertaken are in this role. But second, they want us, I think there's just reasons why this is 100% going to be politicized in their world. The first most basic one is that when there is an election, you need to run a campaign. And in order to run a campaign, you need to have money. And in order to have money, you need to have somebody who's going to give you that money. And you know who we think is going to be very, very likely to help you run your campaign, to give you endorsements from politicians that are already popular, to help you get your name out there, is political parties that want to see you make decisions that will promote their agenda once they're elected. The Republican Party is going to say, okay, well, we'll help you finance and we'll give you these endorsements as long as you promise that you're not going to prosecute Donald Trump, for example. So we think that even if these individuals maybe don't want to become politicized, or there's some issues that they engage in that aren't actually politicized, they have no choice if they actually want any shot at winning the election, because they need to get their name out there. They need to actually have people know who they are so that they can vote for them, and that requires money and having political support. First argument, then, I want to talk about why we think that bureaucracy is necessary for certain roles. The first thing at a very basic level is just efficiency. If every single role in the government, every single administrative job required an election, that would be incredibly inefficient, because think about the process of campaigning. While you are campaigning, you literally cannot practically do your job. You need to be like traveling around, giving addresses. This is a full-time job in and of itself, and that directly trades off with time that you would spend advising the president, or like meeting with the DOJ, deciding what cases were going to be prosecuted, things like that. So we think that you just lose out on a significant amount of time every time there's election cycle. And this leads to things like backlogs and very time-sensitive things like criminal cases, and that's bad. Second, we think that there's a high degree of expertise required for this role, particularly legal expertise. Not only do you need to be able to understand the law and various legal arguments that, for example, the DOJ might use when they decide to prosecute someone, or that you might be making on behalf of the government when you have to defend them in court, but you're also literally advising the president on all of these matters, which means you have to be an expert. So we think that it's pretty important that you actually have that legal expertise, and you don't get the person who is the biggest expert when you have a politician. You get the person who is most popular, and that leads to compromises in the quality of work that you actually get done by this person. But next, we think that there's just a level of complexity to this job that a lot of people don't particularly understand, which is literally why there was an info slide for this motion, even though most debaters are much more well-read than the average person. We think that just people don't totally understand the job of what the Attorney General does. They don't vote in an informed way. They don't really understand what they're voting for, which means either they just don't vote at all in the first place, so voter turnout ends up being super, super low, or they vote based on things that are not actually accurate, and that's just as bad. But finally, we think that campaign promises and the nature of what campaigning looks like means that you can't change as new facts emerge. So if you say, I'm not going to prosecute this individual, and then more facts emerge that point to them being very, very guilty and clearly a heinous person, if you want to be reelected, you have to stick to that promise, or else you lose your base. We think that that's bad. We think that that is a miscarriage of justice, and you cannot have these things be compatible with elections. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
In many circumstances, city councilors are very specialized positions and most people don't know what they do. Do you think the public should be able to vote for city councilors or mayors, or do we think that maybe democracy can solve for a lot of these issues?
I just don't think that being a city councilor is like super, super hard to understand. It's that you like make the policies and the laws that the city government enforces. I think on the comparative, like people don't even understand the types of legal arguments that the attorney general would be elected to make. I think it's obviously a way more highly specialized position. But second, I want to talk about why elections for roles, I want to talk about why we think elections in general are bad. The first benefit that we think occurs when you have this being an appointed position is a system of checks and balances that you cannot have when there's an election. The first basic conflict of interest that can occur is if you are an elected official and your job is to do things like decide whether cases about like voter suppression or other election law are going to be prosecuted, or you have to defend the government in those cases, there is a very obvious conflict of interest that emerges. But also we think that the Constitution is made to protect people from things that are popular but unjust. And we think that once you are now trying to worry about appealing to what is popular, you cannot do things like fight for minority protections if you know that that's not going to get you elected at the next cycle. You cannot actually fully dedicate yourself to pursuing what it is that the Constitution wants you to do, because you have to do what is popular, and that is not always what is right legally. Second, we think that there's also incentives to be bipartisan that you have as an appointed attorney general, because you aren't beholden to a voter base. On the comparative, sure, the president does appoint you, but you have to be confirmed through the Senate, which means that if you're super, super partisan, you're very unlikely to make it through. But also because if you piss them off, there's no consequences. They're not going to remove you for doing something that ideologically they won't agree with. They only will remove you if, like, in the worst case scenario, you are like wildly incompetent. And like, just look to history, not that many attorney generals have been removed for this exact reason. So we think that you have much more room to disagree with the president and also to do things that are bipartisan. Finally, we think elections just lead to a lot of propaganda because it pays off uniquely when you can actually do these things towards electoral means. This is especially true given that you can simplify very, very complex legal cases down to basic facts like, this person killed their mother, they should go to jail, or I put them in jail, and leave out all of the nuances of the case. For example, maybe they were acting in self-defense, or maybe there was this weird legal loophole that ended up being very relevant. We think that the fact that you can just lie and use tons and tons of propaganda is very harmful. For those reasons, proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call the PM.
Hi, I assume you can hear and see me. Verbal POIs, please. Let me turn this on. Okay. Rebuttal and then reconstruction, I need to point out the fact that there is significantly little interaction from all. So I do think our case pushes through by default. Firstly, they say Attorney General does vote on stuff that is that has political implication. Yes, sure, some of the decisions will have some political implication or nuance, and some won't, as per Dragos' examples, right? This is not a discussion because, like, you don't change the kinds of things he votes on or they vote on. What changes is whether party lines is the metric that they take as a final decisional factor when casting that vote, or when deciding whether to block the president, or deciding whether to sue a state because they haven't followed the federal law. So yes, some will be political, some will not. But the discussion is what will their internal motivations be, and whether the responses are likely to be the correct legal decision, or whether they will be along party lines to advantage Republicans or Democrats further on the line. On technocracy versus representativity, they say, oh, but what if they don't understand, or what if they're not competent enough? Come on, let's not be naive here. All people that reach this position, on the short list of the position that the electorate votes on, will be competent enough, because otherwise they wouldn't have gotten, like, support in their branch, they wouldn't have climbed up the judge ranks, they wouldn't have had the proper CV to make it to the final 5 people. So there is a marginal loss of competence, which I'm happy to take, right? Because I don't think people know whether they screwed up on this tiny, tiny, teensy little detail. So I'm happy to undertake this. But the biggest issue of the justice system currently, and this is the second mechanism, is not a lack of skill. There's plenty of people who are very skilled, but the issue is that they're tempted down by political incentive. This removes political incentives and allows people with actual skill to make it through and to be able to use their skills. See, for example, the Supreme Court. The issue that people have with the Supreme Court is not that they're not like competent enough, is that they're heavily politicized. You do not want the Attorney General to fall under the same issue. Marginal loss of competence. I don't care if they have a tiny screw up, given the big impacts that we give you. Lastly, they say people don't understand, so maybe we shouldn't let them vote. As per Dragos's analysis, I'm going to build on this more. They can just, what they will do is that during the campaign, they will just show essentialized legal principles. They don't have to say, this is the law and this is the amendment and this is the legal precedent and this is shit or that. They will just present the broad outlines, intuition pump, the same way we allow people to vote on economic policy, even if they sometimes don't understand Keynesian economy, right?
Point.
Politicians essentialize this and explain to the public by OO metric, you wouldn't let people vote on almost anything because presumably they don't understand how it works. Second rebuttal here, a full degree of understanding is not the main criterion that democracy uses. You allow people of different educational backgrounds or of different, IQ levels to vote because we prioritize representativity and feeling like it is legitimate over your full understanding of the matter you're voting on. Third rebuttal here. You can have leaders of opinions that clarify and explain this legal stuff if there is an actual issue. The media will jump into this, right? An election is heavily mediatized, so there will be a lot of opportunities to explain this stuff to the public. Understanding is neither a criterion nor a reasonable worry that you need to have. Marginal risk here. Before moving on, I'm happy to take CO. 3?
Oh.
Oh, go.
Okay, so there are literally elected judges in the United States, and they run on party lines with a platform of things like being tough on crime, for example, and take party money. Why wouldn't this happen with, for example, the DOJ?
As I've explained, see my guys, really listen to my speech for the love of God. They will sometimes vote on stuff that is political. The discussion is that they don't have to, they're not forced to vote along party lines. Last point of refutation. They say money will come into power, parties will finance these people, and they will end up being politicized. A few ways I can fear this out of the debate. One, we can put a cap to the funds that can be used inside the elections. Europe does this a lot of times for politicians. Two, you can not allow political donations, or the candidates can say, I am the candidate that has not received any political money and thus gain an advantage. See the way AOC does it. Thirdly, the state can give X money to everyone that runs for this position in order to ensure a baseline. Fourth refutation here. Even if there will be different sums of money, it's not the money that eventually gets you elected. If the money were the main thing that got you elected, Bloomberg would have won the presidential election, but he didn't because a lot of times there's other factors as per our previous argument. The upshot of this here is that even if you buy some politicization or if you prove some politicization, I just have to prove less politicization and marginal benefits on our case. They need to prove significant harms in order for them to have a fighting chance. I'm going on to reconstruction, although I shouldn't have to because they interacted very little. Politicization. Why is this a specific tipping point? Because tries to wash it out by saying, yeah, they are politicized anyways. Yes, but there are a few crucial tipping points. One, who is the person that gets into power? The delta here. The profile of somebody who gets elected by people is likely, for example, to be somebody of a more, modest roots, as opposed to white male, pale, stale Stanford guy who was in bed with all the politicians and who knows and has known them all throughout his life. Secondly, after they get into power, how they behave during, and what counts as legacy for them. As per Dragos's arguments, your under opposition side, your incentive scheme is always towards pleasing, not getting out of party lines or pleasing the politicians that got you into power in order to ensure you get full continuous support, or you don't step over connections, or you don't step over your friends. This is completely removed on OG. Fourthly, whether they do X because this is the correct response to the legal problem, or because it would disadvantage or advantage the Republicans. Even if you trust none of this, the scaling of impacts on trust is non-contingent on whether this is non-contingent on what is the result of the election. Just going to cast your vote achieves our impact. It is the most proximate, is a primary impact that a citizen would intuitively prioritize, and it structurally ensures more chances of balance because you feel more emotional safety regarding checks and balances. You follow the rules more. You engage, you report stuff to the police or to the justice system because you feel like you had a say into who gets in or not. OG.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call DLO to close the front half of this debate.
Apologies, I have a bit of a cough. Okay. So what we hear from opening government is that this is a position that shouldn't be heavily politicized. And their solution is to make the person that's the head of the DOJ a politician. I have no idea how this is supposed to work. They then try to make this justifiable by fiating the end of Citizens United and a bunch of other stuff that makes no sense in an American context. So I'm going to start off by taking down their case definitively, and then I'm going to explain what Sarenna tells you and why it's round winning. So in terms of what they're saying, I think that instead of having what we have now, which is Democrat or Republican appointees, we just have Democrats or Republicans in this office. There's a number of reasons why this is likely to happen. So I think that they sort of say, you know, you're like sometimes going to be on party lines, but sometimes not. I think you probably always will. And the intuition pump here is that given that I actually don't even know that everyone in this round could name who the head of the DOJ is right now, let alone all the other cabinet positions, most Americans could not. I'd be surprised if more than like 20% of Americans knew that Merrick Garland was the head of the DOJ. But they will know when they go to vote in an election, assuming they don't pay that much attention to most offices besides the president, which is the case. Like most people don't even know who their senator is. They will look at Democrat or Republican next to their name. And given that people have such strong party affiliations in the United States, those will be the people that they vote for. There might be third party candidates. Maybe they'll get some votes. But compared to someone that also is qualified and has that next to their name, you're not even going to get remotely close. The other thing is that Citizens United is a thing in the United States. Given that people don't care unless you make them care by shoving ads down their throat, money makes a big difference. It is true that you reach some threshold or saturation point where like no more money is going to make that much of a difference. So it's not purely about money, but you need huge amounts of funds in order to win an election, which is why like politicians in Congress spend more time fundraising, doing rallies, trying to get people to vote for them than they do actually writing laws, just like as percentage of their time. That's probably not something we want in bureaucracies, which is why we have bureaucratic positions who are nearly everything. This is probably also the response to what they said about why don't we like take away people's right to vote on most things. The answer is we sort of do take away people's right to vote on most things. They vote on a set of politicians who have a like broad policy agenda, and then those politicians enact that agenda. In reality, the politicians aren't even writing the laws that they pass themselves. They appoint their own staffers to do that for them, because the reality is that it's kind of impossible to have people know all of the minutiae of every single possible person that could be appointed. This included that the logic that they would apply probably applies to every single cabinet position. I think then the nature of these elections, A, becomes more political when they're affiliated with a party, but B, just like the types of campaigns that are likely to be like run are going to be on political issues because those are much more inflammatory, more likely to get the vote out, and more likely to make people care. If it's just about like trial times, that's fucking boring. No one's going to care. No one's going to make really care about turning out to vote for you or against you. But if you say my opponent let a bunch of murderers get away with murder, or like gave them lenient sentences, scares the crap out of people, especially like, I don't know, suburban moms or whatever. Those people eat that shit up and go to vote. This is why in the United States, if you look at the like records of sentences handed out by elected judges versus appointed ones, they tend to be much more severe because simplified, tough on crime, scare tactic rhetoric is extremely effective at garnering votes for people. I think what this means is that you get incentives against nuance, essentially, because any action that you take as a politician that requires too much time to explain to someone and could be taken down by a simple quippy one-liner that makes it seem bad is disincentivized, right? Like, you don't want to show leniency to someone that has a very nuanced case that can be explained by like their history and like the specific details of the crime, when someone will just be like, you let a murderer go or something to that extent, and you like can't respond to that in a soundbite that people are going to understand. What that means is that you get much more harsh prosecution that is probably going against people that don't deserve it. You get a huge simplification of a very complicated role. The counterfactual, in terms of who gets appointed, is generally that politicians appoint people from a slate of candidates that are highly qualified, which is something that voters often don't care about at all, which is why a lot of people that are elected as judges don't even have degrees in law in some places in the United States. And I think that they're like likely to be qualified, but also they're likely to like promote the broad policy agenda of the politician, because people know that people aren't going to necessarily vote based on like specific things the Attorney General does. But if the Attorney General is able to make sure that the policy agenda, for example, as a sort of gestalt thing, is instated by the politician that's elected, then like the public is going to be sort of happy with the state of the country and things are going to be a bit better. So I think broadly they have incentives to act well. They also have just like personal legacy incentives. Like, if instead of thinking, will people like this when I do it based on the simplified media narrative that they hear from Fox News, you think, is this going to be good for my personal legacy? Is this going to be better for the country? These are the types of things that you just can't think about when you're an elected politician, but could think about as essentially a bureaucrat whose job is just like more or less like be like please the president and have a like reasonable legacy for yourself. So I think those are like broadly the effects that we tend to see on their side. I'll take closing before I continue.
Opening?
Not even closing. They haven't engaged with us at all. Okay. Please note that. Yeah, I'll take opening.
Neither side can ensure 100% good or bad action. So the metric should be emotional comfort or likelihood of balance, which we exclusively prove on OG. Engage.
What do you mean emotional comfort? Like, I just told you that you're more likely to have prosecutors going after criminals that don't really deserve to be prosecuted because sound bites will make them look bad if they don't do that. People will spend the rest of their life in prison as a result of policies like this. And you're saying, oh, we should just go on like what makes people feel good. I literally have no idea what you're talking about. I think that probably like the weighing here is much stronger towards our side. In terms of like other aspects of election, it is probably true that in some sense, we might get slightly different results if the public votes on it. For example, the Electoral College often like biases certain outcomes. But the problem is that I think, one, voter turnout in these elections is likely to be very bad, given like people aren't informed, which means that the people that are voting are probably voting on the most inflammatory pieces of rhetoric that tend to have the most negative implications in terms of the way that these people act. And secondly, I think that you're probably going to get these people not able to do their job very effectively, right? If you are like, instead of spending time being able to actually review cases in detail, to like plan prosecutions, for example, appoint qualified people, you're spending more time just like running around the country, giving speeches and stuff. You're way like less likely to be able to do as much good for the country. So in terms of just the utility that these people are able to provide, because ultimately they're like public servants working to make the country better, you're not going to be able to get as much of that. Finally, in terms of politicization, they mentioned the importance of the legitimacy of these offices, that people feel that laws are actually enforced and that they're not going to just break the law if they think that it'll be sufficiently popular for them to do so, because there's an arm's length distance between the head of this office and like the rest of politicians, which is status quo. I think if you think, well, people will like that I did this crime so I can do it, and the public will like vote for it to vote in a person that thinks it's fine, I think you're like less likely to get the enforcement of laws where it matters, especially when it comes to things like, for example, attempted coups. For all of these reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'm very happy to call member of the government to continue the debate.
Cool. Beginning in POIs in chat, by the way. So the concern of opening opposition in this debate is that, well, this is going to be something that the public doesn't know how to vote on effectively, and this is going to lead to a negative impact on the operations of the Attorney General's office. I want to deconstruct why it is that that isn't true. First of all, because there's an incredible incentive to educate the public on this matter. Why? Well, first of all, the political parties that OO says are likely to align themselves with particular candidates have an incentive to make sure that should they win the presidency, they also get their number one pick for who it is that they would like to be alongside them. They would not like to work, for example, as president with an attorney general who's literally of the opposite party, meaning that they have every incentive to make sure that they educate the public not only on, hey, you should vote for our guy, but on exactly what this process is and why it is that this is something that they should spend their time voting on, and stressing the importance of voting on this issue because they already are aware that voter turnout is not always as high as they would like it to be. So in order to ensure that they get the outcome that they would like, they're going to educate in this way. Secondly, it is because individual politicians are likely to do the very same thing, right? Insofar as there are many parties that have different political opinions and have different political ideologies within themselves and have different potential targets, they have an incentive also to educate. Third of all, it is because the individuals who are running have an incentive to be educative. They don't have an incentive to just smear and slander each other, because if people don't even know what they're voting for, but all they're seeing is that both individuals are slandering each other, they don't often want to risk voting for someone who they think is literally a moral hazard, because they see that as something that is likely going to be damaging. Hence, they disinvolve themselves. Instead, people are much more likely to vote when they feel that they are educated about these processes, and as a result are more able to do so. As well, bipartisan committees often generate education for the public. Education systems often generate this type of stuff. I think that this is a non-issue. Secondly, I think that their concerns about why it is that this is going to lead to a less functioning office are also patently untrue. I just think that this is something that will come with the job eventually. If you're on a 4-year, 5-year term, I think you will just eventually learn that you should spend 6 to 8 months campaigning, and you will hire more staff in the interim to be able to fill in your place. You will still build in time to be able to check. I think that this is a very marginal harm, so I'm not sure that this is an issue. Then OO says, well, you're going to have a lot of issues of tough on crime, of people being overly harsh to individuals. I want to first note that I'm not sure why it is that this is a bad thing. If the public generally wants to be very harsh on crime and as a result votes on things that are going to be harsh on crime, and it is what is aligned with the democratic will, OO has not presented an inherent reason why it is that that's harmful, other than just asserting that it is one, and I guess relying on our collective left-wing interest, which sure works on me if I'm judging, but is not necessarily true for the purposes of this debate. And then they say the moderating force is that well, legacy, and you're going to care about your legacy. But this is inherently contradictory because OO also says that nobody knows who you are and people can't name you. I can't see why it is that people are then going to all of a sudden care about their own legacy. They're also aware of the fact that people don't know them and don't care about them. The extension from CG, very straightforward. I'm going to analyze why it is that having a system that is inherently aligned with the interests of, say, a politician and of the president, and having them be the only accountability check is not as preferable as having your incentives and mandate for power stem from the public. And I'm going to analyze why it is that one is preferable to the other. So, why is it that the incentives and status quo are damaging? The first reason is because it determines who even has the opportunity to be appointed as attorney general in the first place. The way that a lot of people become attorney general is through proving their loyalty to a particular presidential candidate over a prolonged period of time. As many people who become president have been in lower levels of government over many, many decades, it means that when their cases are presented to you, you have often already established a predisposition towards ideologically agreeing with them. It means that you've regularly consulted with them. You've already worked with them for a considerable amount of time. What this means is that not only do you have less diversity in who's able to run for these positions, because not everybody has the opportunity to work closely with people who could eventually become the president, but it means also that you have an inbuilt reason to be openly corrupt because you have to already show your loyalty and dedication, so that way the person who eventually becomes president trusts you sufficiently to appoint you to this role. The second reason why it's bad is because OG notes that, well, the party can just tell you what to do. But let's be clear, right? If you ever go out of line with what the mandate and the goals of the president are, there are many people who are equally competent and qualified who are ready to replace you because it is a deeply prestigious and sought after role that as a result, they are likely to fire you immediately. And it means that any concept of your personal stature and your personal stature within the legal community is likely to falter because you've been fired from a very heavy job, meaning that you're incentivized to be aligned with them. The third reason is because you personally have an ability to be very selfish and corrupt, right?
because the only evaluatory metric that exists under government opposition bench is whether or not the president and the government aligns with what it is that you're doing. Meaning that if you do things that are ideological in nature and are oppressive towards other people, but it's simply something that you like and that the president is ambivalent towards, you have a lot of leeway to be able to do this. This is relevant because it means that you can fill a lot of sectors of the current judiciary with people who are likely to be very antagonistic or corrupt, or at the very least just not particularly transparent in their actions, because you literally choose who all of the government's attorneys are going to be at the federal level and choose the mandates that they're going to operate under when it comes to how it is they prosecute. Why is it that our side is preferable? The first reason our side is preferable because on our side of the house, we have a better understanding of what the public opinion wants. There are many instances in which the interests of the government are very misaligned from the interests of the public. For example, if you have the ability to decide which federal laws are enforced, I think it's about 66% of Americans do not want marijuana possession laws to continue to be enforced. But both parties have already established a willingness to continue to enforce these laws and put people in prison for them because they don't really see the benefit of potentially driving away investment, driving away a wedge issue, and as a result, they don't really have an interest in appointing anybody who's going to fight for that issue. When your mandate comes from the public, you now have a new opportunity to fight for specific causes that otherwise you would likely to be fired for because the public actually wants those and would likely put that as a requirement of somebody that they're actually going to work with. The second thing is that in a lot of instances, there are just differences in political belief. For example, you might vote for a particular politician to be the president because you think that they are better than the other alternative, but there might be other attorney general candidates, because there's likely to be more than two, who you think have better interests in terms of what you would like to see happen legislatively. As well, you might be someone who regularly votes for a right-wing party because they benefit you in terms of taxation, but you might have more liberal views in terms of how it is that the judiciary should function. Under status quo, your vote often locks you into only picking one over the other, which means that we get a lot of bad social outcomes because a lot of people don't have their actual view represented in how it is that the government functions. Lastly, I think that there's also just a tool of prioritization here, right? In a lot of instances, there are literally too many things on the docket for these types of jobs to be able to do, which means that even if we have two different candidates who are of the same belief, who are of the same party, who would likely win or be appointed under each side of the house, under our side of the house, the public is better able to determine which type of prioritization they are more likely to want to be able to see in office, because they are able to pick and choose and decide between them and have educational material and questioning periods about how it is that they're going to potentially repeal them in the events that they do not go in line with this, meaning that you're more likely to see attorney general's offices that work more in line with the interests of the people. That's proposed.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'm very happy to call a member of the opposition to open the case for closing up.
Okay. Two very simple contributions from closing opposition. Firstly, why the Attorney General needs good and amicable relationship with the president, noting that this extension is directly responsive to that case from closing government. And second of all, an explanation of the negative ramifications of an election, noting that we are deepening from what we heard at opening opposition. Firstly, why do we think the Attorney General needs to have an amicable relationship with the president? And I think the really important piece of context for this point is that the nature of this role is just very specific. And we note that opening points this out, but they don't explain why that specific nature means that the relationship you need to have with the president is just different to all other roles within Parliament. Because we note the fact that you're doing things like giving submissions to the Supreme Court, doing things like offering legal advice, but importantly, you're also doing things like consulting with the president on particular policies and then ensuring their enforcement. And that means that your ability to work with the president is directly impacted by how friendly you are with them and your working relationship with them. Note the fact, panel, that it is not just you and the president. You are still counteracted by elected officials. So it is not just the two of you working in tandem. There are other people to counterbalance you and to check and balance you. But as a duo, you are just incredibly important. And that means that you need to have a strong working relationship with the president that is just directly diminished by an election. Because the chances of getting someone in election that is not amicable with the president are far, far larger than when they are elected by the executive branch. And I think there are 4 reasons why that relationship with the president is crucial. Firstly, note the fact that the president has good relationships and important relationships with law enforcement agencies. And the important thing about that is it means that the Attorney General can leverage those relationships to divvy out and distribute and enforce laws in a way that are actually efficient. Because it is only when you have good working relationships with members of police, for example, that you are actually able to put into practice the laws that have been prescribed by the Senate. And note that that is crucial, because being able to lay out those laws in a way that actually benefits constituents and that actually works in an efficient manner is just crucial. And those relationships with top law enforcers is essential for that. Second of all, note that the president would otherwise seek power in other ways, because at the point where they don't have the Attorney General on side to appease them, that means that they have to look for other avenues and outlets to enforce their power. No, that looks like things like 1, stacking the Supreme Court. 2, it looks like things like using your presidential pardons in particularly bad ways, but it also looks like things like using your executive orders more, particularly in ways that are democratic. And we note the fact that this already happens and has happened before, particularly under Trump, and that is something that is likely to escalate in its impact when you no longer have the ability to have the Attorney General on side. Thirdly, though, we note that a huge amount of time would be wasted at the point where you have a conflict with the president, because, as our opening neatly establishes for us, the amount of bureaucracy that this person has to go through is massive, and the amount of bureaucratic red tape that they have to deal with on a daily basis is massive. And that means that the time that you would take up dealing with that and an unamicable relationship with a person that you have the most deeply worked personal relationship with is just terrible. But finally, we know that the relationship with bureaucrats matter, given the gravity of the role of the president. Note the fact that opening government says it's politicized, opening opposition mitigates that. We neatly are able to flip that claim by explaining to you that the gravity of the president's role just means that the amount of support you need from the Attorney General is big, otherwise you're going to have 2 incredibly pernicious impacts. Firstly, note that the efficiency of your policy is directly undermined. And that's because now it's just far easier for that policy to be blocked by the Attorney General. And that means that getting that policy through, even when it is good, is just made more difficult, because the ability for you to enforce it is directly minimized by that bad working relationship. But secondly, we note that criminal cases are persecuted and prosecuted far slower under side government, because you lose all those efficiency benefits that you get when you have a good and stable working relationship. And we note the fact that given the president, as I've explained to you, does just have so much gravity in terms of enforcing laws and within the US Constitution, that is huge. And note the weighing of this impact panel, because first of all, we note the fact that the amount of red tape that you have to go through in getting laws out in the first place means that when it comes to the enforcement stage, you need someone who is able to work with you in the way that is as efficient as possible. But secondly, we note the fact that there needs to be someone in the president's corner so that the presidential power isn't abused in far, far worse ways. Having an amicable and friendly relationship is only made possible when you are able to directly elect that person by the executive branch. When you leave it in the hands of the public, the chances of things going right and the chances of getting someone who does not appease the president and doesn't have that presidential loyalty is just bad. And we note the fact panel that even if there are presidential, a government wants to claim presidential loyalty is bad, we note the fact that the other counterbalances that already exist in the status quo are just enough to balance this out at the point where it gets pernicious. Secondly, why do we think there are negative ramifications of an election process, noting that this is a deepening extension? Because opening opposition has 2 claims here. The first is that elections politicize the decisions of attorney generals, and the second is that there's low voter turnout, which means that perhaps the voting process isn't as judicious as it could be. But note the fact that they never impact the problem of low voter turnout or the problem of these elections being bad, and that is just that. You completely reduce the public's trust in the Attorney General, and that is for 4 reasons. The first is that it's incredibly easy for the media to manipulate the result of these elections, and that's simply because the media is tailored to your political perspective, and at the point where everything else is already being manipulated by the media when it comes to politics, this is the only thing left that is not able to be tainted by the media, and you lose out that on side government. Second of all, people now feel the role of Attorney General is less legitimate and less advisory because it is politicized. Note that the Attorney General is just the most official thing that exists in the judicial system. When you lose out on that, you lose out a huge check and balance that people believe exists. Thirdly, we note that pre-smear campaigning that would happen under side government just means that you question the authority and you question the legitimacy and you question the morality of the AG. Note the fact that closing government says, oh, well, you're not going to slander or you won't slander this person. That is so obviously untrue. In any election, slandering and smear campaigns occur. Obviously, the one for the Attorney General is no different. But fourthly, we note that this delegitimizes the Attorney General's ability to do good stuff in office, because now they are vying for the attention and competing for the approval of everyone since they have gone through this election process. What is the impact of decreasing the trust in the Attorney General? 2 things. 1, in the absolute worst case, the result of the election is not accepted. You'll have election fraud. We'd note the fact that there is precedent for this to happen in the US, and this type of election would be no different. But second of all, even when the result is not election fraud, you can just have a result that is is smeared. Note the fact that that looks like things like smaller courts perhaps not accepting the decisions of the Attorney General. It means that there's now less public will to prosecute Congress for their crimes because they don't have faith in the person that is doing it. That is the Attorney General. And note the impact of this panel. The weighing here is simply that the Attorney General is someone that everyone unique has trust in by virtue of the fact that they are not an elected person. They are elected by executive branch. They have a level of legitimacy that other political figures just do not, and that is crucial in the American electoral system. This would be an affront against it. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call Tigoff Whip.
Fantastic. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm going to call for a PY roughly halfway through. Please don't unmute. Okay, am I good to begin?
Yep.
Fantastic. Three, two, one. Simple case from CG, we showed that on our side, attorney generals are going to be making decisions that are more in line with what the public wants and thus what is good for the public. Let's start with CO. First, they talk a lot about gridlock and efficiency. I have no clue why efficiency is good if it is in the pursuit of bad ends. But by that, I mean efficient evil is actually worse than inefficient evil. So if the gridlock that is happening is, as we characterize it, going to be AGs pushing back on, delaying presidential policies that go against what the public wants, that's a good thing. Next, they say that you need a unique relationship for the consulting with the president. I'm unclear how much this relationship actually changes presidential decision-making. Presidents have many, many other advisors. They typically speaking make their platforms on the basis of all sorts of polls and many, many different factors. So I'm really unclear on how much this relationship changes things. Also, presidents have other legal consultants specifically, and if they no longer have the AG, if the AG turns against them, they'll probably find an equivalent role who someone else with a lot of legal expertise. Next, they say that AGs need to be able to enforce the law and have good relations with police. It is simply factually untrue that attorney generals spend a lot of time working with police, talking with police, etc. Look at the info slide. You can see what they do pretty simply. Next, they say that the presidents are going to do other stuff to mess with the legal system, things like way more executive orders. But the problem is this is symmetric. They're going to do this on both sides, given that presidents obviously have a lot of incentives to get whatever they want through. And so if there's any legal barriers to it, they're going to engage in these shady tactics on either side. Next, they say that you need a friendly relationship with the president in order to prevent them from going crazy and like overturning the election. We say the exact opposite is true. You need an attorney general who has the ability to speak up if the president is doing something illegal, because they know that they can't just get fired by the president. You also need them to be possibly in extreme cases willing to approve federal charges against the president. I know there's a norm against that right now, but the norm might change in our world. And so given that the status quo has relatively few checks and balances, completely unlike what CO says, given that Trump almost succeeded in overthrowing the election, we need the attorney general as a last bulwark against the president that wants to overthrow democracy, that wants to turn America into a fascist hellhole. Next, let's talk about their point on trust. They say on our side, we get less trust in the attorney general, and we lose this final apolitical golden gem. The problem is this is factually untrue. And right now, attorney general position is very politicized because they're political appointees. See what Fox News says about Merrick Garland. See what MSNBC said about Bill Barr. There's tons and tons of distrust already. There's not going to be a meaningful delta here. Okay, let's talk OO and then OG. I have a lot to say about OO. First, they say that bureaucracy is good and that if you're campaigning all the time, you can't really do your job. I have two responses, in addition to the one Ethan already said. First, this isn't wasted time. You're spending time learning what voters want, and this means that you as an attorney general are going to be able to do a better job once you get in power. Second, even if it is wasted time, we can easily outweigh it. Why? Because a few months wasted every 4 years for the sake of doing a better job the other 3.5 years is obviously a worthwhile trade-off. Attorney generals aren't really pressed for time that much. The far more important thing is the decisions that they make rather than whether they can make enough decisions. Next, they say it's super important for them to have expertise. As Ethan explained to you, the parties are probably going to nominate experts because you want someone who will be able to do a decent job once they get in power. And obviously in the status quo, oftentimes people just appoint non-expert lackeys appointed just for the basis of loyalty. So even if they don't appoint experts, there's no real delta here. They're probably going to appoint people who at least have a legal degree, and that's probably going to be a requirement to even be a candidate for attorney general in our world. Next, they said there's a lack of understanding of what the attorney general does. We explain what we're going to fix this when elections now spread way more information. This information is going to be spread by politicians and news people and schools and all the other actors that Ethan characterized you have likelihood to engage in this kind of evidence and information spreading. Next, lastly, they said that you're going to be bound to follow campaign promises of the attorney general. This is going to make you inflexible. I like to first flag, it's probably generally good to be bound to follow the promises that you make to voters upon which they have elected you. Second, they're not going to be that inflexible. Politicians break their promises all the time when extenuating circumstances come up, so you can have some flexibility as the attorney general. Next, let's talk about their second main point, which is that elections are bad. First, they say that appealing to what is popular often means that you can't fight for minorities. Here's the problem here. What is popular nationally in America right now, and for the past decade or so, hasn't been oppressing minorities. There's a reason why Democrats have won the last 7 out of 8 presidential elections. We're assuming that this attorney general election won't take place with the Electoral College. And so Democrats and left-wing people are more likely to win on average, given that, whereas when you're talking about the president and the Senate, both of these institutions structurally over-advantage Republicans who, typically speaking, don't like minorities very much. Also, yeah, be comparative here. Republican presidents and Republican Senates can just pick someone who will oppress minorities, and they often do so in the status quo, and they often get in power way more in the status quo, given the problems with the Electoral College and how the Senate is elected. Next, they say that in the status quo, there's very little removal, and that this is somehow a good thing. No, we explain to you why this is precisely terrible for a lack of accountability. That means that attorney generals have way more freedom to do whatever the hell they want, regardless of whether or not it benefits the public. Ethan's already engaged with their legacy stuff. Okay, 2 final things to respond to. I know I have a lot to say here. I think OO was decent. Next, they say that attorney generals are going to win by being tough on crime. So first response, as Ethan explained to you, if the public in fact wants this, then that's totally fine. And they never explained to us why it is that it's sort of inherently wrong to be tough on crime. But also, I don't even think they're going to get more tough on crime stuff on their side. Why? Or less tough on crime stuff on their side. Because in the status quo, as I've already said before, attorney generals appointed by the president and the Senate. The Electoral College, as I've already explained to you, structurally advantages Republican candidates who are likely to be tough on crime. The Senate, given that it gives 2 votes to every single state, and given that Republicans do better in rural states, which have smaller populations, all that manifests as overrepresenting these groups. They're notoriously tough on crime. So when they get in power and appoint attorney generals, they're going to be more tough on crime. That's how we went on tough on crime, but I don't think that's how you should adjudicate this debate. Lastly, on turnout, it's probably going to be the case that the election for attorney general is going to be done at the same time as the presidential election. In fact, on the same ballot, as a lot of these kinds of elections are. So voters are probably already going to be there at the ballot box anyway. So turnout is really a non-factor. Okay, yeah, I'll take the POI from top up. Go.
Your whole case rests on education about the role and the candidates being of a high quality, but parties have very little incentive to do this, given A, it trades off with funding efforts that will help them win elections.
Please stop. Okay, parties are one group that we said are going to be engaging in education. We explained to you why the news media, and perhaps most crucially schools, and probably ballots, which oftentimes contain basic information about the roles and responsibilities of different newly elected positions, all of these other actors are going to engage in education, so voters are going to be able to make a decently informed choice. Also, even if it's the case that voters aren't going to be that well informed, I think it's still the case that it's better that they have a say and that what they want gets manifest in terms of what the attorney generals are going to do. Okay, let's quickly talk about OG. The big problem with OG is likelihood analysis. As both op teams explained, it's really, really unclear how likely it is that we're going to get this apolitical dreamland election that they characterize. Because as CO says, all state level attorney general races already have Democratic candidates and Republican candidates. So why is a national election going to be any different? As OO says, attorney general candidates are probably going to align with parties in order to get campaign funding and endorsements. I'm not knifing here. I'm just saying it's really unclear how likely they are to get this apolitical dreamland. All their case depends on their framing of these elections for attorney general being somewhat or largely apolitical, but they never explain why voters would actually care enough to go out and vote on something like speed of trial. Do voters care at all about this? I really don't know. So their case really just hinges on this point on risk representativity. They never explain why this abstract principle actually matters. And then second, their case is on more moments where the attorney general stands up to the president. This is the right idea, but they never explain when it'll happen, why it's important. So we vertically extend here. They try to model in a way to get around all these problems with their case by saying they're going to just model in ways to make these elections apolitical. This House believes that motion. They don't have the fiat power to do so. So their case entirely follows. We win on likelihood analysis. We win on OO's best case framing. We show attorney generals do things that benefit the public overall. That's obviously the biggest impact in this round. So proud to propose. Thank you very much.